A first century Hebrew walks alone on a hot afternoon, staff in his hand. His shoulders are stooped, sandals covered with dirt, tunic stained with sweat, but he doesn't stop to rest. He has pressing business in the city. He veers into a field to take a shortcut, knowing the owner won't mind. Travelers are permitted this courtesy. Field is uneven, so he uses his staff to balance himself in the dirt. Thunk! The staff strikes something hard. He stops, wipes his brow, pokes again. Thunk! Something's under there, and it doesn't sound like a rock. The weary traveler tells himself he can't afford to linger, but curiosity won't let him go on just yet. He jabs the ground again, and something reflects a sliver of sunshine. He drops to his knees, and he starts to dig. 5 minutes later, he's uncovered it. A case fringed in gold. By the looks of it, it's been there a long time, maybe decades. His heart is racing as he pries off the dusty lock and opens the lid. And his eyes grow large as he sees gold coins, jewelry, precious stones of every color, a treasure more valuable than he could even imagine. Hand shaking, the traveler inspects the coins issued in Rome over 70 years ago. Some wealthy man must have buried this case and then died suddenly. The secret of his treasure dying with him. There's no house around. As he looks at the field, it's just an empty field. Surely the current landowner has no clue of what is there. The traveler closes the lid, buries the chest, marks the spot, turns around, and heads for home. Only this time he's not plodding, he's skipping like a little boy, smiling broadly. What a find! Unbelievable! I've got to have this treasure. But I can't just take it, that would be stealing. Whoever owns this field owns what's in it. I must buy this field. But how can I afford it? I guess I'll have to sell everything. I'll sell my farm, my crops, my tools, my prize oxen. Yes, I'll sell everything. And that'll be enough to buy the field. Everything changed for that man when he discovered the treasure. It captured his imagination. He could think of nothing else. He had a whole new reference point for living, a paradigm shift. He thought of everything now through the perspective of that treasure. He was obsessed. Randy Elkhorn tells the story that way in his book, The Treasure Principle. Jesus originally told the story with just one short verse, teaching us that there is a treasure worth trading everything for. Look what Jesus said in Matthew 13:44. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. This man was willing gladly to give up everything in order to obtain that costly treasure. Should we feel sorry for him because he had to sell everything? No, rather we should envy him, if anything, because whatever sacrifice he had to make paled in comparison to the reward that he gained. The cost far outweighed the benefits. Now, from a short-term perspective, it probably looked like to his neighbors that was a bad move, selling everything. But from a long-term perspective, it was a no-brainer because what he gained was what mattered. And don't miss the phrase here where it says, in his joy, he went and sold all he had and bought that field. Now, Jesus here is talking about something that for this man, it wasn't a sacrifice. It wasn't out of drudgery. It wasn't out of obligation, but out of exuberant delight. And Jesus, of course, is talking here about heavenly treasure. No matter what kind of earthly treasure you pile up, eventually it's going to be either worthless or someone else's. But it is possible to find a treasure that is eternal. And the ultimate treasure is the gospel. Proverbs 2:4-5 says, if you look for wisdom as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. The ultimate wisdom that we can obtain is Jesus Christ himself and his message of salvation. The gospel is of such value that it is worth searching out as though it were hidden treasure, and then rejoicing when you find it, because nothing is more valuable. Look at what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:7-9. He says, but we have this treasure in jars of clay. He's talking about how we steward the gospel, and we're like jars of clay. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. And this changes the way we relate to trouble in this world. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. The gospel is such a treasure that it changes our perspective drastically about life. And we realize that life is not just about us and not about our happiness and not about our stuff. It's all about him. And that enables us to face hardship when it comes in a new way with a new perspective. Paul says in Colossians 2, my goal is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Paul's desire for those believers that he was writing to, and for us, who he was writing to by extension, Paul's desire was that our lives would be all about Jesus, and that we would see him as the ultimate treasure. And when we have that attitude, it's a whole mindset. It impacts our ambition and our reason for living. Once we find the ultimate treasure that is only found in Christ, we now desire to respond to his grace, to live for him, to live not just for this life, but for eternity. That's the name of this series we're in, Living for Eternity. It changes the way we look at our treasure and what we want to live for, how we want to invest our life. We begin to think about the difference, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, between the dot and the line. This simple little illustration here of a dot and a line. This dot represents this life right here that we're living right now. And it seems like a lot of time, but it's here and it's gone. Last week we talked about the dash between two numbers that represents our life here. And how we invest on that dash is going to impact our future. And so here is our life, but this goes on and on and on and on and on and on forever. This is eternity. It never ends, this line. And if we live only for the dot, better fill it full, because that's all you're going to have. But if we live for eternity, if we live for the line, we have both the dot and the line, and that means that we're going to change our perspective from looking only at this life to thinking about how to live for eternity. One of the ways that we demonstrate where our hearts are and what we're living for is how we relate to treasure. Concerning earthly treasure, Jesus said this, I can't take it with me, but I can send it on ahead. He said, do not store up treasure for yourselves on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. He went on to say, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Now, why did Jesus say not to store up treasures on earth? Is it because treasures are bad? No. It's because they won't last. They will eventually be either worthless or someone else's. Worthless because they wear out. Jesus talked about moth or rust destroying them. Or someone else gets them. If not thieves, it's whoever divvies up your stuff when you die. You ever go to an estate sale and you walk through and you think, this was all somebody's treasure at one time, and now I can get a bargain on it. By the way, I hope you have a will. If not, I encourage you to get one, because otherwise, someday your kids might be fighting over all your stuff. And you've probably seen, as I have, families just separated, divided, destroyed because of fights that happen after parents pass away. It doesn't have to happen that way. So part of our stewardship, really, to think about how we manage our stuff here while we're alive, but even after we're alive. And sometimes you have to update your will. A number of years ago, Selena and I sat down with an advisor and we updated our will because we had adopted our daughter from Ukraine, and that changed things, and we had to decide, who's going to be in charge of allocations and percentages and how much we want to give to God's work. So we decided to tithe all our assets after we're gone. By the way, I highly recommend a service called Covenant Trust. It's a branch of the Evangelical Covenant Church that's dedicated to helping people with trusts and wills and responsibly taking care of the future. A lot of people don't want to think about that because none of us want to think about death. We don't want to think about that. But then we're not being really as good as stewards maybe as we should, because we're here and we're gone. There's a dot and a line. We can't just live for the dot. Proverbs 23:5 says, "Cast but a glance at riches, for they are gone, and they are gone. For they will surely sprout wings and fly off to the sky like an eagle." It's only a matter of time. It's not a matter of if we lose our earthly treasures, it's when. And whether it happens while we live, sometimes people lose their treasures, but we all lose them when we die. But it always happens, no exceptions. Imagine something with me. Imagine that you're alive at the end of the Civil War. It's been this terrible, bloody conflict between the North and the South. And you are living in the South, even though you're actually a Northerner who was moved there for some reason. And you plan to move home after the war ends. You're just waiting. And while in the South, you have accumulated a lot of Confederate currency. During the Civil War, it was like two nations in some ways. They had two capitals and two presidents and different currencies. Now, suppose that you know for a fact that the North is about to win the war and that the end is imminent. What will you do with your Confederate currency? If you're smart, there's only one answer. You should immediately cash in your Confederate currency into U.S. currency, because that's the only money that's going to have value when the war is over. Keep only enough Confederate currency to meet your short-term needs, but transfer as much extra as you can into U.S. currency that will still have value. That's sort of how it's like for Christ followers. We have some insider trading tips from Jesus, because we know someday he is going to return. And he's going to be suddenly, unexpectedly, and at that moment, Earth's currency will be worthless. Same thing happens when you die. Either event could happen at any time without warning. I just found out last night, one of my friends I grew up with, he's a year older than me, he died. I haven't even found out yet how or why, but it makes me think, it's sudden and unexpected sometimes. And Jesus assured us that the way to transfer treasure from earth to heaven is the way to move it from the dot to the line, and you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. You never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul, right? Can't take it with you. So think of your money as Confederate money. Nothing wrong with Confederate money as long as you just realize its limits. Recognizing that its value is temporary radically alters your investment strategy. Because if you're busy trying to collect as much money and stuff as you can, it's the same as stockpiling a stack of Confederate money while you're knowing full well that it will soon be worthless. And that's just plain foolish when it comes to investing. Now, Jesus is not against storing up treasure. He encourages us to do it. But he says, be sure you're storing it up in the right place. Neither is he opposed to thinking about what's our own best interest, because he said, store up for yourselves. Nothing wrong with that. It's not selfish to think about your own best interest. And Jesus says, I'm trying to help you out. This is for your best interest, that you send some treasure on ahead. This mentality requires a willingness to delay gratification. Financial planners tell us, don't think 3 or 4 months, don't think 3 or 4 years, think 30 to 40 years as you're doing your investing, trying to prepare for, being able to take care of yourself in older age and so on. Good investment requires planning for the future. But what Jesus does is he takes that advice even further. And he says, don't think about how investments are going to be paying you back in 30 or 40 years. Don't think only about that. But think about 30 or 40 trillion years from now. Anything we try to hang on to here, we will lose. Anything we put in God's hands will be ours for eternity. Martin Luther said, I have held many things in my hands and I have lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess. It's a no-brainer when you really stop to think about it that you would transfer some Confederate money before it lost its value, knowing that you can't take it with you. Look what Psalm 49, 16 and 17 says. It says, don't be overawed when others grow rich, when the splendor of their houses increases, for they will take nothing with them when they die. Their splendor will not descend with them. Now, it's easy to be in awe of people that have really made it, who have, just lots of wonderful things and privileges and opportunities. That's natural. That's natural to appreciate that and think that's nice. But what it says is don't be overawed. I mean, don't obsess on it. Don't get jealous. Don't be envious. Don't be setting that as your goal. Why? Because no matter how much they accumulate, they will take nothing with them when they die. Such an important principle for all of us to be reminded of and to be living with that mentality. I don't know if you know the story of Jim Elliot, but he's a well-known missionary who, when he was only 28 years of age, with a couple other guys, felt called by God to go to this remote Indian tribe in Ecuador that had not really had encounters with people from outside. And their first few encounters, briefly, the people seemed fairly friendly and they were encouraged. But on January 8, 1956, Jim and 4 fellow young missionary men approached that village and encountered 10 warriors who murdered them on the spot. Life magazine published a 10-page story about the murders. And later, Jim's wife wrote a fascinating book, Elizabeth. It's entitled Through Gates of Splendor. And later a movie came out by that same name. And Jim Elliot said this, and I think this is a powerful statement. He said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Now, he was speaking especially about his life, which he was willing to risk, and he did give it up. And later, another movie's been made about this, by the way, one of the sons of one of those guys went back and led much of those people to Christ. And it's a fascinating story. The Point of the Spear, I think the name of that movie is. But think about this statement in connection not only to your life, but to your treasure. The same statement applies. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So how do we store up treasure in heaven? Well, it happens, according to Jesus, when we invest our our time, our talent, our treasure, those resources that we have, in that which will last for eternity. It begins with your own family. It continues with faithful stewardship through the local church. Now, the Bible teaches that we are to give to the Lord and his work through the local church where we are connected, where we are fed, where we are supported. I was just talking to somebody before this service, and they had been looking for a church and gone to quite a few churches, and they're starting to think Grace Place seems to be the right fit. You know, every church has a different culture. And if you move to a place or you have some legitimate reason to leave a church and you're looking, sometimes that can be difficult to find just the right fit. But once you do, you think there's no perfect church. Don't look for that, by the way. But once you do find a church that seems a good fit, lock in, get involved, serve, support, and make that your family. Make that the place you're committed to. And that's where we give our tithes to God's work through the church. We always say you don't give to Grace Place, you give through Grace Place. When God talked to his people in Malachi, he said, bring the full tithe to the storehouse. Now in the New Testament, the storehouse is the church. That's where you get fed. That's where you come to get fed and to serve. And he says, bring it. The Bible tells us how we are to give, and gives us some principles, giving through the local church. Think of several that I want to share with you here, 5, okay? Number 1, cheerfully. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a, what? Cheerful giver. God's not trying to be the IRS. He's not trying to tax you. I don't know how you feel about paying taxes. I appreciate living in this country. I want to do my part, but I am not cheerful about paying my taxes. If you are, God bless you. I am not. And we, always try to save enough. Pastors are considered self-employed, so we do quarterly payments. And we didn't plan it just right this year, and we had some saved up, but not enough. And so, we're scrunched for a couple months trying to figure out. And so when I know I got to pay, I'm not going to pay until the day. It's just a principle of mine. But I wasn't cheerful about putting that check into that envelope to send that in this year. I can tell you that right now. These words actually relate very well to how I feel about paying taxes. Reluctantly and under compulsion. Because I found out before, if I didn't figure it right, I don't know if it's smart or dumb, but I do my own taxes. And once or twice I didn't figure it right, and they let me know. It comes with a letter and a little penalty. So I feel very reluctant, and I feel very much under compulsion. God says, hey, don't look at that you're giving like that with me. That's not the relationship I want with you. I've poured out my grace for you, and I'm just asking for you to respond to my grace with joy from the heart. Decide in your heart, from the heart, cheerfully. Okay? That's the first principle I want you to see about this, what the Bible teaches here on this stewardship responsibility. Number 2 is systematically. Notice how 1 Corinthians 6:2 reads in the Message paraphrase. It says, every Sunday, it's the first day of the week, some translations say, every Sunday, each of you, now a number of these texts that talk about giving use this language, each of you. This is for all of us. Each of you make an offering and put it in a safekeeping, be as generous as you can. When I get there, you'll have it ready, and I won't have to make a special appeal. But notice he's talking about systematically, on a regular, consistent basis. I think the best rule of thumb for giving to the Lord is the same rhythm as you receive income. Some people get paid weekly, and some bi-weekly, and some monthly, and some periodically when sales happen or whatever the case may be. And that's really the best rhythm for supporting not only your family, but God's work through your church family. We always talk every week about ways to give here at Grace Place. And, there's 3 ways to give on our website, texting, and the giving boxes in the auditorium as well. A lot of people have gone to the online giving. graceplace.org, there's a giving tab. It enables you to be systematic, just like you are with your mortgage and your car payment. You're putting the Lord first in your budget, not seeing if there's any leftovers. And some prefer the text to give option. I think it's nice to have both of these because, some people, maybe get a bonus or or don't know when they're going to get paid because of the way they're in sales or whatever the case, and give you a chance to, somebody in our band this morning, just when we were going through this and put that up there, he said, "Oh, I wanted to give today. I'm going to text. Tell me that number again," and boom, it went right through. A few weeks ago, Celine got a notice that we got hacked on our credit card. This is not the first time. I hope it's the last. How many of you ever had your credit card hacked? Oh man, there are a lot of dishonest people in this world. And it said over $7,000 was spent at 11 o'clock at night at a nightclub in California. I don't want to know what was going on there. $7,000. And our bank took care of it. We didn't have to pay for it. But it is a freaking hassle because you got to go back through. And if you got your card, poor Celine had to go back through and change everything that's connected to that card, which is a lot. The first thing she did is go to graceplace.org and change our online giving and make sure that we had our new number in there. And she also clicks on a little option on there. She told me when we were talking about this week that pays the credit card fees because the church pays the fees if you use a credit card, unless you click that. It's your decision. I mean, we end up paying a little more, but she feels like it's worth it because of all the rewards we get with airline miles. Systematically. That's the way God teaches us to give. Further, he teaches us to give proportionately. 1 Corinthians 16:2 says, "On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income." Notice those key words right there. In keeping with your income. That's God's plan, proportionately. In other words, those who make more, give more. Those who make less, give less. And it impacts everyone the same way because it's in keeping with your income. That's God's plan. It's proportionate giving. Now, back in the Old Testament, Israel was required to give a tithe, which means 10%. Tithe means 10%. If you're giving 10% of your income, you're tithing. Sometimes people use the word tithing to just cover any offering. I'm gonna throw $20 in and tithe. No, it's not tithing unless you just made $200. And sometimes people realize we're not in the Old Testament anymore. We're in the New Covenant now. And so, unfortunately, sometimes people use this idea of freedom in the New Covenant as an excuse to give less than the tithe. Now, this is between you and God. But if you want to be biblical about it, I would say, if anything, the New Covenant should call us to more, not less. Because grace is a greater motivator than law when it comes to generosity. But nevertheless, historically and biblically, 10% is a time-honored benchmark to be exceeded if God prospers you to that place. But a benchmark, a starting place. Celine and I have been practicing this discipline of tithing for 40 years. That's how long we've been married now, 40 years plus. And we believe and we know that God has blessed us for it, both tangibly and intangibly. And we have a list of examples that we're convinced are God's blessing as a result of us putting Him first consistently with our money. But we don't do it to get a blessing. That's a wonderful side benefit. We do it as obedience and worship, high-level worship. You know, the only place in all the Bible where God said to test Him was in regards to this. In the last chapter of the Old Testament, Malachi, God says, bring, not give. He talks about giving offerings. Bring. It's already God's, and we're acknowledging that by bringing that 10%. He says, bring the full tithe into the storehouse. And then he says, watch what's going to happen. He said, test me in this, because I'm going to open the windows of heaven and pour out blessings on you. He said, test me. Take him up. If you haven't done this, I encourage you to test him. That's why we established some time ago a thing called the Tithe Challenge. And if you go on our website and go under giving, there's a place you could sign up for the Tithe Challenge. What that is, and this is confidential, no one will know about it if you decide you don't want to continue. But besides, our finance director. But what you do on there is you say, okay, I'm going to take God up on this test. He said, test me. So for 90 days, I'm going to put him first with 10% off the top of any income I get. And then I'm going to see how things are going. The Tithe Challenge is a guaranteed refund. You get everything that you gave for 90 days back if you think God's not living up to his part of the deal. We'll put your picture up the next week on the screen. No. Trust me, be completely confidential. And to this day, a number of people have done that, and no one has ever come back and asked for a refund. It'll happen if you ask. In fact, I got an unsolicited note this week from someone that said, we started a new business a year ago, and it's doing way better than we expected. And I asked my husband how he explains that, and he said, it's because we did the Tithe Challenge. I wouldn't be surprised if he's right. I never want to set a lower standard of baseline giving than the tithe. But many of us find opportunities to go beyond the minimum level as the Lord blesses us and expands our hearts or needs arise. And that's why the Bible talks about tithes and offerings, because offerings are something that's in addition to the tithe. Next week, we're going to have a Compassion Sunday. Compassion International. I always look forward to this. It's an opportunity for generosity as a whole church and as individuals and families, where we sponsor kids that are in extreme poverty. And we look at that. We have 3 kids we're sponsoring, 2 in Ecuador and 1 in Peru. We look at that as offerings, not tithe. We don't take a portion of our tithe to do that. It's over and above, as many other things are. And you may want to get involved if next week, pray about it. If you're not yet involved, if you are involved, you're going to be really affirmed that you're doing something of value. Next week, we're going to have a Compassion graduate with us, and he's got a lot of personality, great story. I'm looking forward to you meeting Owen. And not everybody can afford to do this, $38 a month, but many people can. Can't even hardly go out to eat these days for $38. There's 2 of you. So we're talking about what the Bible says about investing our resources and giving through the local church, proportionately, and number 4, generously. Generously. 2 Corinthians 9, verse 6 says, remember this. This is worth remembering, okay? Because we forget quickly. I do. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. This is a principle, a fixed principle of God. It not only is true in terms of farming and harvesting, but in terms of investing in God's purposes. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. You decide what you want to reap, and then you sow accordingly. Because this is a fixed principle the Lord has laid down. And he promises a direct blessing for generosity. He will bless you tangibly and intangibly when you put him first with your money. And the blessings are often in proportion to the degree of generosity. He said that. Jesus said, give and it will be given back to you, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. So we want to give generously, and sometimes God invites us to give sacrificially. 2 Corinthians 8:3, Paul talks about some churches. He said, I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. And you can't do that all the time or you'll be broke. But sometimes God will prompt you to give until it hurts. Take care of a certain need respond to something that he's put on your heart. And maybe if you've just been a tipper, not a tither, stepping up from that to being a tither for you is a sacrifice. I understand that. But if you've been a tither and God calls you to step up to something else, he may ask you sometimes, and it may be for a special cause that he lays on your heart. That God says, I just am convicting you to give more than normal on this occasion, maybe more than you're really able, because this is the time. And I know a lot of people did that when we sacrificed to buy this land and build this building. Some people sold things, some people took home equity loans. We did both. I mean, just sacrifices. And that type of giving builds faith, honors God, and results in rich blessing. Laying up treasure in heaven begins in your own home and it continues in faithful stewardship through the local church. Time, talent, treasure. But it doesn't stop there. It continues with just living out a life of generosity, choosing a lifestyle of generosity where you're looking for needs and then caring in the ways you can, sharing, serving, helping, giving to others, investing in people, which is an investment that is for the line, not just the dot. It's an investment that lasts forever when you invest in people. And ultimately, the most loving thing you can do for someone is help them find Jesus and be saved. Last week, we talked about rewards in heaven, and one of them will be meeting people that you influenced in such a way that you are a part of how God brought them to heaven. But many people need to see the love of Jesus in action before they're able to put their faith in him. And especially those who are extremely poor, abused, hurting, helpless, victimized, disabled, or otherwise disadvantaged. They may have some basic needs that must be addressed before they're able to start thinking about eternal needs. That's very true of the compassion families that we sponsor in extreme poverty. And I've learned that since COVID-19 impacted the globe in so many different ways, there has been a food crisis that has developed around this world. And I want you to just take a couple minutes to listen to the leader of Compassion International. I respect him. I've met him a couple times, Jimmy Miato. And in this video, he's talking to you, if you're a sponsor. And he's basically doing a year-end thanking you video if you're involved in helping to reach the less fortunate. Listen to Jimmy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing some time with me today, and especially for being an advocate for changing children's lives through Christ's love. This time of the year, I love to reflect back on the past year and consider all that's been accomplished together, thanks to your inspiring generosity and God's faithful hand of blessing. And as this year comes to a close, I'm so grateful that even in the face of an immense global food crisis, we've been able to support 2.3 million children, witnessing some amazing life outcomes and impact along the way. And one of the things that we're most pleased about is the thousands of children who have graduated from their Compassion program and are moving into adulthood with confidence, well equipped to fulfill the purpose that God has for them. We also celebrate the many child development centers that opened just this year despite the lingering effects of the pandemic. These new local church partners are so passionate about meeting the needs of children who are living in unacceptable circumstances within their communities. Each new center can support about 200 additional children. And in addition to expanding into these impoverished communities, we're also continuing to welcome new children into more than 8,200 existing centers all around the world. It's so meaningful to care for these children and to hear their stories. Stories like that of 13-year-old CHEERFULLY from Nicaragua. CHEERFULLY is thrilled to be the first in her family to go to school, thanks to the partnership between her sponsor, Compassion, and her local church. Or the story of 11-year-old Aaron from Indonesia, who received 2 critical heart surgeries that saved his life. These interventions are especially critical right now as we face the largest global food crisis since World War II. Nearly 10% of the world's population stands to be significantly impacted or impaired by hunger. And we anticipate that 1 out of every 4 Compassion Child's family will need ongoing food support throughout this crisis. And since the beginning of the pandemic, Compassion's church partners have delivered over 23 million food packs. It's during incredibly challenging times like these that we are so grateful for our expansive network of caring local churches that know the needs of their communities and can respond quickly and efficiently. And just as our churches on the front lines of poverty are standing in the gap for our affected families, I pray that you will continue to stand with us as we serve them together. Most importantly, please know that your prayers make such a difference and are so appreciated. And if you're able to give, please consider making a generous year-end gift. Your giving will help ensure that we can continue to meet the holistic needs of the children we serve together and provide emergency food relief where it's needed the most. Thank you. Thank you so much for your ongoing faithfulness during this global food crisis. This is an incredible opportunity for us to put our faith in action as we walk alongside those who are suffering. May God continue to bless you abundantly as you live beyond yourself in caring for the least of these.
Did you know Jesus talked more about money than any other subject in the Bible? Including heaven and hell. Why? Why did Jesus talk so much about money? Because of this simple principle. My heart follows my treasure. Look what Jesus said, Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Jesus knows that. Your checkbook, your Visa statement, your cash receipts, your bank statement reveal where your heart is. It's a simple test that reveals a lot. And notice Jesus didn't say, where your heart is, there your treasure will be, which can also be true. But he wanted to say it this way because I think he wants us to know that our heart follows our treasure. And so put your treasure where you want your heart to follow. Wherever you put your treasure, that's where your heart will be, Jesus said. You got to be intentional. You got to decide in advance about it. Do you want to live only for the dot, or do you also want to live for the line? Put your treasure where you want your heart to be, because your heart always follows your treasure. Ultimately, this is a vital issue because, as Jesus also said, I cannot serve 2 masters. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, he says, no one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. That's what Jesus had to say about this. You can't serve 2 masters. You might have 2 jobs with 2 bosses. You might have several siblings. You might have a dozen friends. But if you're married, you better have only 1 spouse. Right? Got an amen on that one. Some relationships are by very nature exclusive. And thus is our relationship with God. There's only room for one on the throne. Choose him as your master. You cannot serve 2 masters. Who is your king? If you want it to be Jesus, then you must choose him daily to be king and let nothing else creep onto the throne of your life. Now, Jesus is king of the universe regardless of what you do or don't do. Nothing's going to change that. But he gives you freedom to choose whether he's your king. And one of the ways that we realign our priorities and choose him first is through worship. Many different ways to worship. We've talked about one today. Worship him with our resources. We can worship him by coming together like we're doing now and singing praises to him. And we're going to do that now. We're going to sing an anthem that declares our faith in Jesus as King. It's called Hymn of Heaven. I love this song. And before we sing it, I invite you to listen to author and singer Phil Wickham as he talks about writing and performing this song.